The crisp October morning arrived with the kind of bite that promised winter was lurking just around the corner. Lady Margaret Thornfield adjusted her wool coat as she approached the imposing gates of Windsor Castle, her breath forming small clouds in the chilled air. At 62, she had been Queen Camilla's personal aide for nearly 8 years, a position that had granted her unprecedented access to the inner workings of the British royal family. Margaret's heels clicked rhythmically against the cobblestones as she made her way through the familiar corridors. Today was meant to be routine, a simple research mission to the Royal Archives where she needed to retrieve historical documents for the Queen's upcoming speech about women's literacy programs. The speech was scheduled for the following week at Westminster Abbey, and Camilla had specifically requested information about Queen Victoria's education initiatives. The Royal Archives housed centuries of British history. Tucked away in the castle's east wing, the collection contained everything from medieval manuscripts to modern correspondence. Margaret had visited these hallowed halls dozens of times over the years, always accompanied by the same elderly archivist, Professor Edmund Hartwell, who had become something of a friend during her frequent visits. As she approached the archive entrance, Margaret noticed something different. Instead of the usual single guard who typically nodded her through with a polite smile, there were now 3 guards stationed at the door. The lead guard, a stern-faced man in his 40s whom she didn't recognize, stepped forward as she approached. "Good morning," Margaret said cheerfully, reaching into her handbag for her identification card. "I'm here for my appointment with Professor Hartwell." Lady Margaret Thornfield, aide to Her Majesty Queen Camilla. The guard's expression remained impassive as he examined her credentials. After what seemed like an eternity, he looked up and met her gaze. "I'm afraid I cannot allow you entry today, ma'am." Margaret blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Your access to the Royal Archives has been revoked, effective immediately," the guard replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "By order of His Majesty King Charles III. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She felt her knees weaken slightly, and she gripped her handbag tighter to steady herself. "There must be some mistake. I have an appointment. Professor Hartwell is expecting me. The Queen needs these documents for her speech next week." "There is no mistake, ma'am. I have my orders directly from the King's private secretary. Your name has been removed from all access lists, permanently." Margaret's mind raced. Just yesterday, she had been in the Queen's private study, discussing the upcoming speech and the specific historical references Camilla wanted to include. There had been no indication of any problems, no hint that anything was amiss. The Queen had been in excellent spirits, excited about highlighting the historical precedent for royal involvement in education reform. "May I see the documentation?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Surely there must be some written order you can show me." The guard's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing the genuine confusion in her voice. "I'm afraid I cannot share the details of the order, ma'am. But it comes from the highest authority. Perhaps you should speak with your supervisor." Margaret felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. Her supervisor was the Queen of England. The implication that she somehow didn't understand the chain of command within the royal household was both insulting and baffling. "The Queen is my direct supervisor," she said, maintaining her dignity despite the growing humiliation. "And, I can assure you, she was not aware of any such order when I spoke with her yesterday evening." The guards exchanged glances, and Margaret caught a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. It was clear that her situation was unusual, possibly unprecedented. Royal aides, particularly those of the Queen's stature, simply did not get barred from archives without extraordinary circumstances. "Nevertheless, ma'am, I cannot allow you entry. I suggest you contact the appropriate offices to clarify the situation." Margaret stood there for a moment, processing the surreal nature of what was happening. Around her, the castle continued its daily rhythm, footsteps echoed in distant corridors, staff members hurried about their duties, and the ancient walls seemed to watch impassively as this strange drama unfolded. "Very well," she said finally, mustering what remained of her professional composure. "I'll need to make some calls. May I ask your name, in case I need to reference this conversation?" "Sergeant Davies, ma'am. Royal Guard Division." Margaret nodded curtly and turned on her heel, walking back down the corridor with as much dignity as she could manage. But, once she rounded the corner and was out of sight, she stopped and leaned against the wall, her heart pounding. In 8 years of service to Queen Camilla, she had never encountered anything like this. The royal household operated on protocols and procedures that had been refined over centuries. Changes to access permissions, particularly for senior staff members, were not made lightly or without extensive communication. She pulled out her mobile phone and dialed the number for James Patterson, the king's private secretary. If there had been some sort of administrative error, James would be able to sort it out quickly. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. "James, this is Margaret Thornfield. I've just been denied access to the royal archives by the guards, who claim the order comes directly from His Majesty. I need to speak with you urgently about this matter. Please call me back as soon as possible." Next, she tried calling Professor Hartwell directly. Perhaps he had been informed of some last-minute change in protocol. The professor answered on the second ring, his elderly voice warm and familiar. "Margaret. I was just setting up for our appointment. Are you running late?" "Edmund, I'm at the castle, but the guards won't let me in. They say my access has been revoked by the king." "Did you receive any notification about this?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Revoked? That seems highly irregular." "I've received no such notification, and I certainly wasn't informed that today's appointment was cancelled." "Are you quite certain that's what they said?" "Quite certain. I'm as confused as you are. Has anything like this ever happened before in your experience?" Professor Hartwell had been the chief archivist for over 30 years. If anyone would know about unusual access revocations, it would be him. His answer chilled Margaret to the bone. "Never, my dear. Not once in 3 decades have I seen a senior royal aide suddenly barred from the archives. There are protocols for this sort of thing, procedures that must be followed. If someone's access were to be revoked, it would typically involve a formal review, written notifications, and a clear explanation of the reasons." Margaret felt a growing sense of unease. This wasn't just an administrative mix-up. Something more significant was at play, something that reached into the very heart of the royal household's power structure. "Edmund, I need to get to the bottom of this. The Queen is expecting those documents for her speech. Can you possibly gather the materials we discussed and find another way to get them to me?" "I'm afraid that would be impossible, Margaret. If the guards have been instructed not to allow you access, I cannot simply hand over archival materials to someone who has been officially restricted. It would cost me my position, and potentially create a much larger diplomatic incident." Margaret understood completely. Professor Hartwell was in an impossible position, caught between his decades-long relationship with her and the absolute authority of royal protocol. She couldn't ask him to risk his career for what might be a temporary misunderstanding. "Of course, I understand completely. Please don't do anything that might jeopardize your position. I'll sort this out through proper channels." After ending the call, Margaret found herself standing in one of Windsor Castle's grand corridors, feeling more isolated than she had in years. The familiar surroundings suddenly seemed foreign and unwelcoming. Portraits of long-dead monarchs gazed down at her with expressions that seemed almost accusatory. She decided to try one more approach before admitting defeat. Margaret made her way to the office of Helen Morrison, Camilla's chief of staff. If anyone would have insight into what was happening behind the scenes, it would be Helen. Helen's office was located in the Queen's wing of the castle, and Margaret had to pass through 2 more security checkpoints to reach it. At each checkpoint, she held her breath, half expecting to be turned away again. But her identification was accepted without question, and she was allowed to proceed. Helen's assistant, a young woman named Sophie, looked up from her computer as Margaret approached. "Oh, Lady Thornfield. I wasn't expecting you today. Is everything all right? I need to speak with Helen urgently. Is she available?" "She's in a meeting with the communications team about next week's events." "But you look quite pale. Are you feeling well?" Margaret realized that her distress was probably written all over her face. She had always prided herself on maintaining professional composure, but today's events were testing that resolve. "I'm fine, Sophie. Just need a quick word with Helen about a scheduling matter." Sophie studied her face with concern but picked up her phone to call into Helen's office. After a brief conversation, she hung up and nodded toward the door. "She can see you now, but only for a few minutes. The meeting is quite important." Margaret entered Helen's spacious office to find her standing behind her desk, looking harried but professional. At 55, Helen Morrison had been managing royal communications for over a decade, and her reputation for discretion and efficiency was legendary within palace circles. "Margaret, what's so urgent?" "I've got the communications team waiting." "Helen, I've just been barred from the royal archives. The guards say it's by direct order from the king. I have no idea what's happening." Helen's expression changed immediately. Her professional mask slipped, revealing genuine surprise and concern. "Barred from the archives? When did this happen?" "About 20 minutes ago. I was there for my appointment to gather materials for the Queen's literacy speech. The guards wouldn't even let me speak to Professor Hartwell." Helen moved around her desk and closed the office door, ensuring their privacy. "Margaret, I haven't heard anything about this. And, trust me, something of this magnitude would typically cross my desk. Access revocations for senior staff are serious matters that require careful coordination." "That's exactly what I thought. I've tried calling James Patterson, but he's not answering. Professor Hartwell confirms he received no notification. It's as if this order appeared from nowhere." Helen sat down heavily in her chair, her mind clearly racing through the implications. "This is highly unusual. The king doesn't typically issue direct orders about archive access without going through proper channels. And certainly not without informing the Queen's staff if it affects her aide. What do you think could be behind this?" Helen was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing her words carefully. "There have been tensions recently. Nothing overt, nothing that would typically affect day-to-day operations. But the relationship between their majesties has been under some strain." Margaret felt her stomach drop. Royal marriages had always been complex affairs, balancing personal relationships with constitutional responsibilities. But Charles and Camilla had seemed to find their rhythm over the years, presenting a united front in their public duties. "What kind of tensions?" "I probably shouldn't be discussing this, but given your situation, you need to understand the context. There have been disagreements about the scope of the Queen's independent activities. His Majesty has expressed concern about some of her initiatives proceeding without his direct approval." The pieces began to fall into place in Margaret's mind. Camilla's literacy program had been her personal passion project, something she had developed largely independently of the king's official agenda. Could Charles be asserting control over his wife's activities in such a dramatic way? "You think this is related to the literacy speech?" "It's possible. The historical research you were conducting would have provided the Queen with powerful precedents for independent royal action. Queen Victoria's education initiatives, for instance, were often undertaken without Prince Albert's direct involvement." Margaret realized the implications immediately. If Camilla could demonstrate historical precedent for queens acting independently on social issues, it would strengthen her position in any internal power struggle with her husband. "So by blocking my access to the archives, someone is preventing the Queen from building her historical case?" "That would be my assessment, yes. Though I'm speculating based on incomplete information. What I can tell you with certainty is that this level of intervention is unprecedented in my experience." Helen glanced at her watch, clearly torn between her loyalty to Margaret and her obligations to her waiting meeting. "I need to get back to the communications team, but, Margaret, you need to be very careful about your next moves. If this is indeed a power struggle between their majesties, you don't want to find yourself caught in the crossfire." Margaret nodded, understanding the warning implicit in Helen's words. Royal households had always been places where personal relationships and political maneuvering intersected in complex ways. As a senior aide, she was privy to sensitive information and held a position of trust that could easily become a liability if not managed carefully. What would you suggest I do? For now, nothing dramatic. Don't make any calls to the press, don't write any memos about the incident. Give me 24 hours to make some discreet inquiries. I'll try to find out exactly where this order originated and whether it's part of a larger policy change. As Margaret left Helen's office, her mind was spinning with questions and concerns. The corridor that had seemed hostile earlier now felt like a maze of political intrigue and hidden agendas. Every staff member she passed seemed to be looking at her with new interest, as if word of her morning's humiliation had already begun to spread through the castle's gossip network. She made her way back to her own small office, located in a quieter section of the Queen's wing. The room was modest by palace standards but comfortable, with a window overlooking the castle's private gardens. Normally, the view provided her with a sense of peace and connection to the historic surroundings. Today, it felt like a reminder of how precarious her position had become. Margaret sat at her desk and opened her laptop, intending to review her calendar and cancel the afternoon meetings that had been scheduled around her planned archive visit. But, as she scrolled through her appointments, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Her access credentials for the palace's digital systems had been revoked. The computer screen displayed a message she had never seen before: access denied. Please contact your system administrator for assistance. Margaret stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The archive incident had been shocking enough, but this suggested a much more comprehensive action. Someone wasn't just blocking her access to historical documents, they were systematically removing her from royal systems entirely. She reached for her desk phone to call the IT department, but the line was dead. Her mobile phone showed full signal strength, but when she tried to access the palace's internal network, she received the same access denied message. For the first time since arriving at the castle that morning, Margaret felt genuinely frightened. This wasn't a simple administrative error or even a targeted restriction related to the archives. This was a coordinated effort to isolate her from her normal channels of communication and information. Margaret gathered her personal belongings from her desk, uncertain whether she would be allowed to return. The small items that had made the space feel like home: a photograph of her late husband, a paperweight from her university, a small plant that had somehow survived in the castle's dim lighting, now seemed like evidence of a life that was rapidly being dismantled. As she prepared to leave, Margaret caught sight of herself in the mirror behind her door. The woman looking back at her appeared older than she had that morning, her face marked by stress and confusion. 8 years of dedicated service to the crown had earned her respect, influence, and a sense of purpose that had sustained her through the loneliness of widowhood. Now, in the span of a few hours, all of that seemed to be slipping away. The walk back through the castle corridors felt like a journey through enemy territory. Staff members who would normally greet her warmly now averted their eyes or offered only the most perfunctory acknowledgments. Word of her changed status was clearly spreading, and no one wanted to be associated with someone who had apparently fallen from grace. As Margaret reached the main entrance, she turned back for one last look at the ancient stones that had been her professional home for nearly a decade. Somewhere within these walls, decisions were being made that would determine not only her future but potentially the future relationship between King Charles and Queen Camilla. The guards at the entrance nodded politely as she passed, unaware of the drama that had unfolded deeper within the castle. To them, she was simply another royal aide completing another routine day of service to the crown. If only they knew how dramatically that service had just been called into question. Outside the castle gates, Margaret pulled out her mobile phone and dialed the number for Queen Camilla's private line. Whatever was happening behind the scenes, the Queen needed to know that her aide had been systematically cut off from the resources required to prepare for next week's speech. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Finally, a voice answered, but it wasn't the Queen. "I'm sorry, but Her Majesty is unavailable at this time." "May I take a message?" Margaret recognized the voice as belonging to another aide, someone junior to her in the household hierarchy. The fact that this person was now answering Camilla's private line suggested that Margaret's isolation was even more complete than she had realized. "This is Lady Margaret Thornfield. I need to speak with the Queen urgently about the preparations for next week's speech." There was a pause, followed by a response that chilled Margaret to her core. "I'm afraid Lady Thornfield is no longer authorized to speak directly with Her Majesty. All communications should be directed through the proper channels." The line went dead. Margaret stood outside Windsor Castle's gates, holding a silent phone and watching the late afternoon shadows lengthen across the ancient stonework. For the first time in 8 years, she was completely cut off from the world she had served with such dedication. And she had absolutely no idea why. The web of palace intrigue. Margaret Thornfield spent a sleepless night in her modest London flat, her mind racing through every conversation, every interaction, every seemingly innocent exchange from the past few weeks. At 3 in the morning, she found herself at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, making notes on a legal pad about anything that might explain her sudden exile from royal service. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that Helen Morrison had been right about the underlying tensions between the king and queen. Margaret had witnessed small signs over recent months: brief, tense exchanges during public events, carefully neutral expressions when they thought no one was looking, and an increasing tendency for their staff to coordinate separately rather than jointly. As dawn broke over London, Margaret's phone rang. The caller ID showed Helen Morrison's personal number. "Margaret, thank God you're awake. We need to meet, but not at the palace. Can you come to my flat in Belgravia? And, Margaret, don't bring your phone. Leave it at home." The request to leave her phone behind sent a chill down Margaret's spine. In the modern royal household, such precautions were only taken when someone feared electronic surveillance. Helen's apartment was only a 20-minute drive from Margaret's flat, but the journey felt like crossing into enemy territory. Helen's building was a converted Victorian mansion in one of London's most exclusive neighborhoods. Margaret had visited once before, for a small dinner party Helen had hosted for senior royal staff. Today, the elegant surroundings felt ominous rather than welcoming. Helen answered the door herself, looking haggard and anxious. She was already dressed in her work clothes despite the early hour, suggesting she had slept as poorly as Margaret. "Come in quickly," Helen said, glancing nervously up and down the hallway before closing the door and engaging multiple locks. Helen's living room was tastefully furnished with antiques and artwork collected during her years of service to various royal households. But, this morning, the atmosphere was far from comfortable. Helen paced near the windows while Margaret took a seat on an elegant sofa. "I've spent the entire night making inquiries," Helen began without preamble. "What I've discovered is both more complex and more serious than we initially thought." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "How serious?" "The order to revoke your access didn't come from the king directly. It came from Sir Reginald Ashworth." Margaret recognized the name immediately. Sir Reginald was Charles's longtime private secretary, a man known for his absolute loyalty to the king and his ruthless efficiency in protecting royal interests. If Ashworth was involved, the situation had political implications that reached far beyond a simple access dispute. "What does Ashworth have against me personally?" "Nothing, as far as I can determine. But he has significant concerns about the Queen's growing independence, and he views you as an enabler of activities that could potentially embarrass or undermine the king." Helen stopped pacing and sat down across from Margaret, leaning forward with the intensity of someone sharing state secrets. "There's something you need to understand about the literacy speech you were researching. It wasn't just about education reform. The historical precedents you were looking for would have provided Camilla with powerful ammunition for a much larger argument about the constitutional role of queen consorts." Margaret frowned, not immediately grasping the implications. "I don't understand. The speech was about women's education. What does that have to do with constitutional issues? Think about the specific examples you were researching. Queen Victoria's education initiatives weren't just charitable activities, they represented assertions of independent royal authority. When Victoria established schools and literacy programs without direct parliamentary approval, she was claiming the right to act as a sovereign power rather than simply as a consort or figurehead. The realization hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had been so focused on the charitable aspects of the historical research that she had missed the political subtext entirely. You're saying that Camilla wanted to use historical precedent to justify acting independently of Charles on policy matters? Exactly. And Sir Reginald saw that as a direct threat to the unified royal authority that Charles has been trying to establish since his coronation. Helen stood up and walked to the window, peering through the curtains as if checking for surveillance. Her paranoia was beginning to seem less irrational and more necessary. There's more, Margaret. Your access revocation wasn't an isolated incident. 3 other senior staff members who work directly for the Queen have had their privileges restricted or modified in recent weeks. The pattern suggests a systematic effort to limit Camilla's independent capabilities. Margaret thought about the junior aide who had answered Camilla's private phone the previous evening. Who else has been affected? Patricia Wells, the Queen's private correspondence secretary, has had her signing authority revoked for all official letters. David Cameron, not the former Prime Minister, the other David Cameron who manages the Queen's charitable partnerships, has been reassigned to work under the King's Charitable Foundation rather than operating independently. Margaret knew both Patricia and David personally. They were consummate professionals who had served the royal household with distinction for years. The idea that they were part of some coordinated restriction was both shocking and deeply unsettling. This sounds like a palace coup, Margaret said quietly. That might not be too strong a term. What we're seeing is an attempt to systematically reduce Queen Camilla's independent authority and bring all her activities under direct oversight from the King's office. Helen returned to her seat, her expression grim. But here's what really concerns me, Margaret. The speed and coordination of these actions suggests that someone has been planning this for months. Your archive access wasn't revoked as a reaction to recent events, it was revoked as part of a pre-existing strategy. Margaret felt a growing sense of betrayal. She had dedicated years of her life to serving both the Crown and Queen Camilla personally. The idea that her loyalty and competence had been called into question as part of a larger political calculation was deeply painful. Do you think the Queen knows what's happening? Helen's expression became even more troubled. That's the most disturbing part of all this. Based on my conversations with various palace sources, I believe Camilla is being kept in the dark about the full extent of the restrictions being placed on her staff. She's being told that these are routine administrative adjustments rather than coordinated limitations. That's why she seemed normal when I spoke with her 2 days ago about the speech. Exactly. She probably still expects you to deliver those historical documents. She has no idea that you've been systematically cut off from the resources necessary to complete the assignment. Margaret stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where Helen had been standing. The elegant Belgravia Street below looked peaceful and normal, a stark contrast to the Machiavellian intrigue being discussed in the apartment above. What happens when she realizes what's been done? When she tries to contact me directly and discovers that I can't even access basic palace systems? That's the question that's been keeping me awake all night, Helen admitted. If Camilla discovers the restrictions and decides to fight them publicly, it could create a constitutional crisis. The British public is not prepared for open conflict between the King and Queen. Margaret turned back from the window, her mind racing with possibilities and concerns. But if she doesn't fight back, if she simply accepts these restrictions, then Charles effectively wins by default. Camilla becomes a ceremonial figurehead rather than an independent royal authority. Which is exactly what Sir Reginald and his allies want. They believe that a unified royal voice, controlled entirely by the King, is essential for maintaining the monarchy's credibility in the modern era. Helen pulled out a thick folder from beneath her coffee table and handed it to Margaret. I've been doing research of my own, trying to understand the historical context for what we're witnessing. Margaret opened the folder to find photocopied documents, newspaper clippings, and typed notes spanning several decades of royal history. What am I looking at? Evidence that similar power struggles have occurred in previous generations. When Prince Philip married Queen Elizabeth, there were significant behind-the-scenes conflicts about his role and authority. The palace establishment worked very hard to ensure that Philip understood his subordinate position. Margaret flipped through the documents, recognizing some of the events Helen was referencing. The early years of Elizabeth's reign had indeed been marked by tensions about Philip's ambitions and his attempts to modernize royal protocols. But Philip eventually found his niche and worked successfully alongside Elizabeth for decades. True, but only after he accepted certain fundamental limitations on his independent authority. The question is whether Camilla will be willing or able to accept similar restrictions. Helen leaned forward, her expression intense. There's something else you need to understand, Margaret. Your situation has implications that go far beyond your personal career. You've become a symbol in this conflict, a test case for whether the Queen's staff can be systematically undermined without significant consequences. Margaret looked up from the folder, feeling the weight of unwanted responsibility. What do you mean? If Sir Reginald can successfully isolate and remove you without any meaningful pushback from Camilla or public scrutiny, it establishes a precedent for further actions against other staff members. You're the canary in the coal mine. The metaphor was apt, and deeply unsettling. Margaret had always thought of herself as a behind-the-scenes professional whose primary goal was effective service to the crown. The idea that her career had become a political football was both surreal and frightening. So what are my options? Do I fight back publicly? Do I try to contact the Queen directly? Do I simply accept what's happened and look for another position? Helen was quiet for several minutes, clearly considering the implications of each possible course of action. Publicly fighting back would be professional suicide, and it would likely harm the Queen more than help her. Going to the press would violate your oath of confidentiality and make you unemployable in any government or institutional role. Margaret nodded, having reached the same conclusion during her sleepless night. Trying to contact the Queen directly is also problematic. If Sir Reginald's people are monitoring her communications, and they almost certainly are, any attempt you make to reach out could be intercepted and used as evidence that you're disloyal or insubordinate. That leaves acceptance as the only viable option? Not necessarily. There's a fourth possibility, but it's risky and would require careful coordination. Helen leaned back in her chair, her expression calculating. What if we could find a way to make the Queen aware of what's happening without directly violating protocol or providing ammunition to Sir Reginald's operation? Margaret was intrigued but cautious. What did you have in mind? The literacy speech is scheduled for next week. If Camilla discovers at the last minute that the historical research hasn't been completed, not because of incompetence, but because her aide was blocked from accessing necessary resources, she'll start asking questions. And those questions will eventually lead her to discover the broader pattern of restrictions on her staff. Exactly. But the key is that the discovery has to appear natural rather than orchestrated. If it looks like we're trying to manipulate her into a confrontation with the king, it will backfire spectacularly. Margaret considered the proposal carefully. It was clever, but it also placed her in an extremely vulnerable position. If the plan failed, or if Sir Reginald discovered what they were attempting, the consequences could be severe. What would be my role in this scenario? You continue to maintain complete professionalism and protocol compliance. If anyone asks about your status, you simply explain that you're unable to complete your assigned research due to access restrictions, and you refer all questions to the appropriate authorities. Helen stood up and began pacing again, her mind clearly working through the details of the strategy. The beauty of this approach is that it's completely truthful and doesn't require you to violate any confidentiality agreements or protocols. You're simply doing exactly what you're supposed to do: follow proper channels and refer problems to the appropriate authorities for resolution. Margaret saw the logic, but she also recognized the personal risks involved. And if Camilla does discover what's happening and decides to fight back, I'll be at the center of a very public and very ugly conflict between the king and queen. That's the risk, yes. But, Margaret, you need to understand something important. This conflict is going to happen whether you participate or not. Sir Reginald's operation is too extensive and too obvious to remain hidden indefinitely. Camilla will eventually discover what's being done to limit her authority. Helen sat down again, fixing Margaret with an intense stare. The only question is whether that discovery happens in a controlled way that gives her time to respond strategically, or whether it happens as a complete surprise at the worst possible moment. Margaret thought about the queen she had served so loyally for 8 years. Camilla was intelligent, politically savvy, and capable of considerable determination when her core interests were threatened. But she was also someone who valued loyalty and trusted her staff to handle sensitive matters with discretion. If I go along with this plan and it works, Camilla gets advance warning about the restrictions being placed on her authority. If it fails, I'm destroyed professionally and probably personally as well. That's a fair assessment of the stakes, yes. Margaret closed the folder of historical documents and set it aside. The weight of the decision before her felt enormous, but she also recognized that doing nothing was itself a choice with significant consequences. There's one more thing I need to understand, Helen. Why are you willing to risk your own position to help me with this? You have far more to lose than I do. Helen was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the morning traffic beginning to build on the Belgravia streets. Because I believe that what's happening is fundamentally wrong, she said finally. I've spent my entire career serving the crown, and I believe deeply in the institution of the monarchy. But institutions survive by adapting to changing circumstances, not by suppressing internal voices and consolidating power in the hands of a single individual. She turned back to Margaret with an expression of grim determination. If we allow Sir Reginald to successfully orchestrate this power grab without any meaningful resistance, we're setting a precedent that will damage the monarchy's credibility for generations to come. Margaret understood the broader implications of Helen's argument, but she also recognized that idealistic motivations didn't provide much protection against political retaliation. I need some time to think about this, Helen. The decision you're asking me to make could affect the rest of my life. Of course. But, Margaret, you don't have very much time. The literacy speech is in 6 days. If we're going to implement this strategy, we need to begin making moves within the next 48 hours. As Margaret prepared to leave Helen's apartment, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. Palace intrigue was as old as the monarchy itself, but she had never imagined that she would find herself at the center of such a conflict. Walking back to her car, Margaret noticed that the autumn morning had given way to a gray, overcast afternoon. The weather seemed to match her mood perfectly, uncertain, ominous, and full of the promise of storms to come. That evening, Margaret sat in her flat with a glass of wine and Helen's folder of historical documents spread out on her dining room table. The parallels between past royal conflicts and current events were striking and deeply unsettling. Again and again, she read accounts of loyal servants who had been caught in the crossfire between competing royal authorities, their careers destroyed as collateral damage in larger political wars. But she also read about individuals who had found the courage to stand up for their principles even when the personal costs were enormous. Some had been vindicated by history, while others had been forgotten or vilified. The common thread among all of them was that they had chosen to act according to their conscience rather than simply accepting the path of least resistance. As the night wore on, Margaret found herself thinking not just about her own career prospects, but about the kind of monarchy she wanted to serve. Did she believe in an institution where power was concentrated in the hands of a single individual, or did she believe in a more collaborative model where different royal voices could contribute to the national conversation? The answer, when it came to her, was both clear and frightening. She knew what she had to do, even though the consequences were impossible to predict. Margaret Thornfield was going to fight back #the Queen's Discovery. 3 days after her meeting with Helen Morrison, Margaret Thornfield received an unexpected phone call at 7 in the morning. The number on her caller ID was one she didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. Margaret, this is Camilla. We need to talk immediately. Can you come to Clarence House within the hour? Margaret's heart began racing. Queen Camilla's decision to call personally, using an unfamiliar number, and to request an urgent meeting at her private residence rather than at an official palace location, suggested that something significant had happened. Of course, Your Majesty. I'll be there as soon as possible. Use the private entrance on Stable Yard Road. I'll have security expecting you. The line went dead, leaving Margaret staring at her phone with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Whatever had triggered this urgent summons, it was clear that the careful strategy she and Helen had discussed was about to be tested in real time. Margaret dressed quickly in her most professional attire and made the drive to Clarence House through London's morning traffic. The Queen's private residence had always felt more personal and less intimidating than the official palaces, but today even the familiar Georgian architecture seemed ominous. The security guard at the private entrance checked her identification with unusual thoroughness before escorting her through corridors she had walked hundreds of times before. But, instead of leading her to one of the formal reception rooms where she normally met with the Queen, the guard directed her to Camilla's private study on the second floor. Margaret knocked softly and was immediately invited to enter. She found Queen Camilla standing behind her desk, still wearing a dressing gown despite the late morning hour. Her usually impeccable appearance was disheveled, and her expression was a mixture of anger and confusion that Margaret had never seen before. "Sit down, Margaret. We have a great deal to discuss." Margaret took a seat in one of the comfortable chairs facing the desk, trying to read the Queen's mood and prepare for whatever revelation was about to unfold. "Your Majesty, I should explain about the research for your literacy speech. I encountered some difficulties." Camilla held up a hand, cutting off Margaret's carefully prepared explanation. "I know exactly what difficulties you encountered, Margaret. The question I need answered is why you didn't inform me immediately when those difficulties began." The directness of the question caught Margaret off guard. She had expected to have to explain the archive incident and the broader pattern of access restrictions. Instead, it appeared that Camilla already knew about these events and was focused on Margaret's response to them. "Your Majesty, I was advised to work through proper channels and not to trouble you with what might have been a temporary administrative issue." Camilla's expression sharpened. "Advised by whom?" Margaret found herself in the exact position Helen had warned her about, trapped between conflicting loyalties and forced to choose between protecting her colleagues and serving her primary duty to the Queen. "I consulted with several members of the palace staff to better understand the situation before bringing it to your attention." "And what conclusion did you reach through these consultations?" The question was delivered with the kind of precision that suggested Camilla already knew more about the situation than she was revealing. Margaret realized that her usual diplomatic deflections were not going to be sufficient. "I concluded that the restrictions placed on my access to royal resources were part of a larger pattern affecting several members of your staff, and that these restrictions appeared to be coordinated rather than coincidental." Camilla nodded grimly, confirming that Margaret's assessment aligned with her own understanding of events. "What I still don't understand, Margaret, is why you thought it was appropriate to handle this situation without informing me directly. Do you believe I'm incapable of managing conflicts within my own household?" The question stung, because it touched on Margaret's deepest concerns about her role and responsibilities. She had spent years trying to shield the Queen from unnecessary complications and administrative details, but, in this case, her protective instincts had backfired. "Not at all, Your Majesty. I believed I was following proper protocol by attempting to resolve the issue through established channels before escalating it to your level." "Proper protocol?" Camilla's voice rose slightly, revealing the depth of her frustration. "Margaret, I am not a middle manager in a corporate office. I am the Queen of England, and, when my staff is systematically undermined, that is not an administrative detail to be handled through proper channels. That is an attack on the Crown itself." Margaret felt a chill at the Queen's characterization of recent events as an attack on the Crown. The language was stronger and more political than anything she had expected. "I apologize, Your Majesty. I clearly misjudged the appropriate response to the situation." Camilla walked around her desk and sat in the chair next to Margaret's, creating a more intimate and less formal atmosphere for their conversation. "Margaret, I need you to understand something important. What has been done to you and to other members of my staff is not simply a personnel matter or an administrative reorganization. It represents a fundamental challenge to my authority and independence as Queen." The Queen's directness was both refreshing and frightening. Margaret had spent years navigating the subtle indirectness of royal communication, where important matters were often discussed through implication and suggestion rather than explicit statement. "Your Majesty, may I ask how you discovered the extent of the restrictions that have been placed on your staff?" Camilla's expression became even more grim. Because I attempted to use my own access credentials to retrieve the archival materials you were blocked from obtaining. And I discovered that my access had been restricted as well. Margaret felt her breath catch. If the Queen herself had been cut off from historical archives, the scope of Sir Reginald's operation was even more audacious than anyone had imagined. They restricted your access as well? Not entirely, but significantly. I can access materials related to ceremonial functions and charitable activities, but anything touching on constitutional precedents or historical examples of independent royal authority has been classified as requiring additional authorization. The implications were staggering. Margaret realized that Sir Reginald's strategy wasn't simply about controlling Camilla's staff, it was about controlling Camilla herself. Who has the authority to grant such additional authorization? Officially, the Lord Chamberlain's office. Practically, Sir Reginald Ashworth. Camilla stood up and walked to the window overlooking the gardens of Clarence House. Her posture was tense, and Margaret could see the strain of recent events in the set of her shoulders. Margaret, I need to ask you a direct question, and I need a completely honest answer. Do you believe that my husband is personally aware of and supportive of these restrictions? The question was the one Margaret had been dreading since her conversation with Helen. Any answer she gave could be interpreted as taking sides in a potential conflict between the King and Queen. Your Majesty, I don't have direct knowledge of His Majesty's involvement in these decisions. What I can tell you is that the restrictions appear to be coordinated and systematic rather than coincidental. Camilla turned back from the window, fixing Margaret with an intense stare. That's not what I asked you. Based on your experience and your understanding of how this household operates, do you believe Charles is aware of what has been done in his name? Margaret took a deep breath, recognizing that this was a moment that would define her relationship with the Queen going forward. Yes, Your Majesty. I believe he must be aware. The scope and coordination of these actions would be impossible to implement without his knowledge and approval. Camilla nodded, as if Margaret's assessment confirmed her own conclusions. Then, we have a problem that goes to the very heart of our marriage and our joint service to the Crown. The Queen returned to her chair, her expression thoughtful and determined. Margaret, I'm going to share something with you that I haven't discussed with anyone else, including my husband. For the past several months, I have been working on an initiative that goes far beyond the literacy speech you were researching. Margaret felt a growing sense of anticipation mixed with apprehension. I have been developing a comprehensive proposal for expanding the constitutional role of Queen consorts, based on historical precedents and modern democratic principles. The literacy speech was intended to be the opening move in a much larger campaign to establish greater independence and authority for my position. The revelation explained everything: why Sir Reginald had acted so swiftly and comprehensively, why the restrictions had been implemented with such precision, and why the archive access had been so important. Your Majesty, that's an extraordinarily ambitious undertaking. And an extraordinarily necessary one, I believe. The monarchy's survival in the 21st century depends on our ability to adapt to changing social and political expectations. The British public expects their Queen to be more than a ceremonial figurehead. Camilla leaned forward, her expression intense and focused. But what I've discovered over the past few days is that there are powerful forces within our own household that are determined to prevent any such adaptation. They want to maintain the traditional model where all authority flows through the King, and where the Queen serves only in a supportive capacity. Margaret understood the broader implications of what the Queen was describing. This wasn't just a personal conflict between husband and wife, it was a fundamental disagreement about the future direction of the British monarchy. What are your intentions, Your Majesty? How do you plan to respond to these restrictions? Camilla was quiet for several moments, clearly weighing her options and their potential consequences. I have 3 possible courses of action, Margaret. I can accept the restrictions and abandon my independence initiative, which would preserve domestic harmony but essentially concede defeat on the constitutional questions I believe are crucial for the monarchy's future. Margaret nodded, understanding the appeal and the limitations of this approach. I can confront my husband directly and demand that he reverse the restrictions, which would likely result in a private battle that could damage our marriage and potentially create public scandal if it becomes known. This option seemed fraught with personal and political dangers that could affect not just the royal couple but the entire institution of the monarchy. Or I can find a way to continue pursuing my independence initiative while working around the restrictions that have been placed on my staff and resources. Margaret felt a growing sense of excitement and trepidation as she realized the implications of the Queen's third option. The third approach would require a great deal of careful planning and coordination, and it would involve significant personal risks for everyone involved. Including me, Margaret said quietly. Especially you, Margaret. If I choose to continue fighting for greater independence, I will need staff members who are willing to operate in a more challenging and potentially dangerous environment. The Queen's use of the word dangerous was not hyperbole. Palace politics had always been a high-stakes game where careers could be destroyed by association with the wrong faction or the wrong cause. What would you need from me, Your Majesty? Complete loyalty, absolute discretion, and the willingness to take significant personal and professional risks in service of what I believe is a larger cause. Margaret thought about her conversation with Helen Morrison and the historical examples of loyal servants who had faced similar choices in previous royal conflicts. And if I'm not willing to take those risks? Then, I will understand completely, and I will find a way to arrange a graceful transition for you to another position that doesn't involve these conflicts. The Queen's offer was generous and understanding, but Margaret realized that accepting it would mean abandoning not just her current position but her belief in the principles that had motivated her service to the crown. Your Majesty, I need to ask you directly, do you believe your independence initiative is in the best interests of the monarchy and the British people? Camilla's expression became passionate and determined. I believe it is essential, Margaret. The traditional model of royal authority worked when society accepted rigid hierarchies and when women's roles were strictly limited. But we live in a different world now, and the monarchy must evolve or risk becoming irrelevant. The Queen stood up and walked to a bookshelf lined with volumes on British history and constitutional law. Every great British queen has faced a moment when she had to choose between accepting traditional limitations and fighting for greater authority. Elizabeth I, Victoria, Elizabeth II, they all understood that the crown's survival sometimes requires challenging established conventions. Margaret found herself inspired by the Queen's historical perspective and her passionate commitment to institutional evolution. But she also recognized the enormous personal costs that such battles could entail. What would be my first assignment if I agree to continue serving in this new capacity? Camilla turned back with a smile that was both warm and determined. Help me deliver the literacy speech exactly as originally planned, using historical precedents that demonstrate the constitutional basis for independent royal authority. But we'll need to find creative ways to obtain the research materials since traditional channels have been blocked. Margaret felt a surge of excitement at the challenge. After days of feeling helpless and isolated, she was being offered the opportunity to fight back in a meaningful way. I accept, Your Majesty. Then, we begin immediately. And, Margaret, from this point forward, all of our communications should be conducted with the assumption that they may be monitored. We'll need to develop alternative methods for sensitive discussions. As Margaret prepared to leave Clarence House, she realized that she had just committed herself to a course of action that could define the rest of her career and potentially influence the future of the British monarchy. The quiet rebellion had begun.